Good morning. This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing titled Access to Mental Health Care and Traumatic Brain Injury Services, addressing the challenges and barriers to veterans. I would also like to ask unanimous consent that Representative Sinema of Arizona be allowed to join us here on the dais to address the issues before us today. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Providing the necessary care and treatment for traumatic brain injury has to be among the highest priorities of the Department of Veterans Affairs. The nation's returning soldiers who have survived the devastating blast from improvised explosive devices and ordnance deserve the best possible medical care for their injuries that this nation can offer. They also deserve compensation for the disabilities connected to their military service. Given the prevalence of TBI among the veterans of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, all veterans receiving medical care at VA are required to undergo screening for it. According to the Defense Centers of Excellence for Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury, more than 287,000 service members have sustained traumatic brain injury between 2000 and the third quarter of 2013. Almost 80% of these injuries were classified as mild TBI. According to Dr. Robert Petzel, Undersecretary of Health, there has almost been a 70% decline in the number of severe TBI cases in recent years, while the number of mild to moderate cases has increased. He said, quote, "It costs much less to treat that group than the polytrauma cases," unquote. As a result, the administration's budget request for FY 2015 is for $229 million for TBI medical programs, down nearly 1.3% from FY 2014. Today, we will hear from veterans and their families about the serious long-term consequences of traumatic brain injury. We will hear about the continuing challenges veterans have to getting access to necessary services for TBI. Even with mild TBI, which constitutes the great majority of cases, VA is failing to provide proper screening and may be undercompensating veterans with very real disabilities. Today, Captain Charles Gatlin and his wife, Ariana Del Negro, will testify about the traumatic brain injury Gatlin suffered in an ID blast and about their subsequent struggles with VA. When Captain Gatlin was medically discharged from the Army, he had a 70% disability rating from the Department of Defense. Notwithstanding the fact that Captain Gatlin had already undergone 3 comprehensive neuropsychological tests by doctors at the Department of Defense that indicated mild TBI, Captain Gatlin was subjected to a perfunctory test by a psychologist at VA when he moved to Fort Harrison, Montana in 2009. As a result of this test, Captain Gatlin received a rating of only 10% disability by the VA. Significantly, the psychologist who administered the VA screening has been brought up on adverse licensing charges by the Board of Psychologists for the state of Montana. The board has reasonable cause to believe that the VA psychologist misused a diagnostic test and failed to conduct his assessment in accordance with the applicable standard of care. The VA has enlisted the Department of Justice to defend the psychologist on the grounds that state licensing laws are preempted. Essentially, the Department of Justice is arguing that VA can use unqualified personnel in substandard tests at its discretion in disability determinations. Substandard sampling for TBI research apparently is also a problem at VA. According to a recent study, only 5.4% of eligible veterans participated in responding to VA's markers for the identification, norming, and differentiation of TBI and PTSD. The MIND study is what it was called. The poor response rates cast significant doubt that the $3 to $4 million of taxpayer money on the mine study over the past 5 years was well spent. I want to thank all of the witnesses for appearing at this hearing today. Your testimony is important, and in the end will lead to more consistent, comprehensive, and compassionate care for our nation's veterans. It is our job to see that we get it right, and we do not fail those who have sacrificed so much for this country. With that, I now recognize Ranking Member Kirkpatrick for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Congresswoman Sinema, for being here today for the veterans and their families in District 1 and in Arizona and across the country. I'd also like to acknowledge that our colleagues, Congressman Barber, Grijalva, and Gosar, have members of their staff here today. They are in Yuma for the dedication of the John Roll United States Courthouse. I also thank all of you who are here today, whether to participate or to observe. Your presence is greatly appreciated. As members of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee and as members of Congress, we have a duty to stand up for our veterans. It is our job to fight for those who have served. I called for today's hearing because ensuring access to timely, safe, quality health care for our veterans is one of my top priorities. We need to examine the connection between TBI and PTS and access to care. Many of us are aware of the troubling reports about the Phoenix VA Medical Center and the patient deaths allegedly caused by long wait times for an appointment or consult. While we don't have all of the facts, we do know that delayed care is denied care. And I have already called for a hearing on this after the Inspector General's investigation is completed. I am deeply concerned that lengthy appointment wait times in the VA system may be discouraging veterans from seeking help when they need it most. With TBI being the signature injury of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, we know that having a traumatic brain injury can amplify the symptoms of PTS. Many of our veterans suffer TBIs, and they also suffer from PTS. Their needs need to be sustained, and they need quality care for the rest of their lives. In Arizona, many of these veterans live in rural areas, including our Native American veterans. These men and women need the same care and the same services as veterans in urban areas near large VA medical facilities like Tucson. The VA healthcare system must be able to provide timely, high-quality care to the veterans who are already in the VA system and be ready for the expected increase in the number of veterans who will soon become part of the VA system. This hearing will focus on how VA is addressing the needs of our veterans who have sustained traumatic brain injuries and suffer from mental health conditions. From this hearing, I hope to identify where improvements by the VA are needed and to identify some best practices and resources to care for our veterans. I hope this feedback can help break down barriers for access to mental health services. The Tucson VA is one of 23 polytrauma network sites, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists from the Southern Arizona VA Medical Health System on how they are providing treatment for our veterans with TBI and PTS. I also want to thank our first panel for sharing your stories with us. I know it must be difficult, but hearing from you allows me and this subcommittee to better understand the challenges and barriers to proper care. I, along with the subcommittee, continue to hear stories of many struggles veterans face when trying to access VA mental health and TBI services. Whether it is a delay in care, a denial of care, or care is just not available, frustration with the system may lead to the veteran foregoing needed care altogether, which is unacceptable and can lead to crisis. I look forward to hearing from our panelists today and have a productive discussion on these very important issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. With that, we have the first panel at the witness table. On this panel, we will hear from Mr. Derek Duplessis, Regional Alumni Director of the Wounded Warrior Project, Captain Charles Gatlin, United States Army retired, and his wife, Ariana Del Negro, co-founder of Veterans Leadership Assistance. I would now like to allow Ranking Member Kirkpatrick to introduce the remaining witnesses on our first panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure to introduce a few members from our first panel. Mr. David Anderson is a veteran and the post commander at the American Legion. David is also Native American, and we are very interested in hearing your perspective. Thank you for being here. Mr. Jerry Bowles, also a veteran, is chairman of the Rock Soldiers for Wounded Warriors. Just had surgery, and this is a committee meeting. It's so important to him that he made it here today. Thank you very much. Mr. John Davison is a dear friend of mine from Flagstaff, father of a wounded warrior who just committed suicide, and I spoke at the funeral service. And this is tough for me and for John and his family, so there may be some tears. And then I'd like to introduce Brad Hazel. Brad is also a veteran, and Brad worked in my congressional office in Casa Grande, has a stunning reputation of helping our veterans, and we look forward to your testimony. Thank you.
Each of your complete written statements will be made part of the hearing record. Mr. Duplessis, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Kaufman and Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, thank you for inviting Wounded Warrior Project to testify on behalf of both a professional and personal concern for me. In 2006, in August, 1 week before my second deployment to Iraq was to end, a suicide bomber left me severely wounded, effectively ending my 13-year U.S. Army career as a cavalryman, airborne armor paratrooper, and scout. I spent the next 2 years recovering from injuries. That included a severe penetrating traumatic brain injury, a shattered right femur, a completely shattered right arm that was nearly amputated, burns, nerve damage, and PTSD. I've been working with and on behalf of Wounded Warriors since a few months after I medically retired from the U.S. Army in 2008. I'm proud to serve as the Western Regional Director for Wounded Warrior Project's Warrior Engagement Programs. In addition to operating 20 direct service programs for almost 50,000 warriors with whom we work, Wounded Warrior Project conducts an annual survey. Our most recent survey found that 3 most common reported health problems among our warriors are PTSD at 75%, anxiety at 74%, and depression at 69%. More than 44 have experienced a TBI. The survey shows that the effects of mental and emotional health problems are even more serious than the effects of physical problems, with more than 25% in poor health as a result of severe mental health conditions. On mental health care, access to mental health care is clearly vital, but access alone isn't enough. Care must also be both timely and effective. We see wide variability in VA mental health care from facility to facility. My own experience at the Tucson VA has been very positive, but many other facilities still seem to lack enough mental health staff despite VAs adding some 1,300 new mental health professionals. VA has also put in new emphasis on scheduling initial mental health appointments within 14 days. But there's also a big difference between being seen for an initial assessment and actually starting treatment, which may occur for weeks or months, leaving some veterans feeling desperate. Despite the hard work of dedicated clinicians at many VA facilities, we still see evidence of a system that is understaffed and under stress. Here are some examples we see around the country. Veterans who need individual therapy are frequently being pushed into group therapy or taking the group option because the wait time for individual treatment is too long. Some rural VA clinics are placing veterans who have depression or anxiety on waiting lists or not providing them treatment at all to give priority to those with combat-related PTSD. Large number of warriors are reaching out to our organization for help in finding mental health treatment options because of VA timelessness issues. VA facilities can seldom provide treatment proactively as needed, and instead can only react when the veteran's condition deteriorates to a point of crisis. And as we learned from a recent survey, of those who sought VA care for military sexual trauma-related condition, 49% reported difficulty assessing that care. We don't suggest that these are simple problems, but it's not good enough to say that the VA is seeing high percentage of veterans when treatment is often sporadic or limited to providing medications. Access to timely, effective treatment should be the norm, not simply a distant goal. Regarding traumatic brain injury, we are particularly concerned of VA's failure to implement bipartisan legislation Congress enacted in 2012. That law was aimed at providing long-term rehabilitation of veterans with TBI, and it calls for VA to apply a new model of TBI rehabilitation. Under the law, rehab services are not to be cut off based on or the view that the patient has plateaued. The law also directs VA to provide any community-based services or support that might contribute to maximizing the veteran's independence. The point is that rehab services should not end when the veteran returns home. For many, the rehab journey only starts then. But we see no evidence that the VA has implemented this law or that it had any effect on VA practice. It remains common for warriors to have TBI rehab services discontinued after a set number of treatment sessions or based on the view that the warrior has plateaued. And families report they are left to their own devices to continue the warrior's rehabilitation. The upshot is that 25% are paying out-of-pocket services VA is not providing. 1/4 of those pay more than $300 monthly out of pocket to provide rehabilitative services. Wounded Warrior Project is not just complaining. We have established a program of our own, providing 140 warriors with severe TBI, the very kind of community support VA should be providing. We'll be expanding the program to help more warriors, but we also want VA to implement the TBI law and urge the subcommittee to press that point back in DC. Finally, we look forward to working with you here in Arizona and the nation's capital to improve the care of veterans with mental health needs and those with a TBI. In the Army, we were always taught to have faith in our equipment. My helmet here today testifies that faith. If I was not wearing this helmet, I would not be here today. We now put our faith as warriors and veterans in you, the government, and the VA. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duplessis, and thank you so much for your service. I come from a Colorado military family, congressman from Colorado, and my father was World War II Korea. I was first Gulf War and Iraq War.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Ms. Del Negro and Captain Gatlin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. My name is Ariana Del Negro, and my husband, Captain Char Gatlin, and I would like to formally submit our written testimony for the record. We're here today to voice our profound concerns regarding the VA's handling of CMP claims for residuals of traumatic brain injury and unethical practices not only at the Fort Harrison VA in Helena, Montana, but potentially across all VA systems. The consequences are far-reaching. The emotional, physical, and financial tolls placed upon the veterans and their families in seeking to right wrongs in the system is unacceptable and warrants immediate corrective action. As Chairman Kaufman mentioned, my husband, who was the Scout Recon, who's the PL for Scout Recon platoon, was retired from the Army in 2009, having received a 70% rating for his traumatic brain injury. In stark contrast, at the Montana VA, he was given a 10%. The discrepancy between the DoD's rating and the VA's rating and the failure accountability of the latter are the basis of our concerns with the VA. The lower rating assigned was a consequence of the fact that the examiner, a clinical psychologist, was not licensed to conduct neuropsychological testing. The test he used was a screening measure for dementia, not TBI, and he misinterpreted the results, thus providing CMP raters medically inaccurate information for which to base their disability rating. As my husband will attest to next, our efforts to rectify the straightforward matter have been met with hostility and stonewalling from weak leadership. What will it take for a system to be held accountable where the interests of the veterans are placed before the bureaucracy of the system?
Third stands as a Ranger Creed. Never shall I fail my comrades. I will keep myself mentally alert, physically strong, and morally straight, and I will shoulder more than my share of the task, whatever it may be, 100% and then some. The VA needs to learn that. Good afternoon, Honorable Chairman and Ranking Member Kirkpatrick. My name is Captain Charles Gatlin, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to participate and discuss an epidemic of dynamic proportions that is manifesting within my state of Montana, the increasingly dysfunctional nature and competence of the Fort Harrison VHA and VBA. I would like to submit my oral testimony annotating my unequivocal level of frustration with the fraud, waste, and abuse with respect to TBI systems operation and associated personal and professional misconduct within the Montana VA. The VA in Montana is experiencing problems with respect to accountability and patient care. While I realize that no one system is perfect, at what point do senior echelon staff and officials choose to ignore and even mitigate major concerns brought to their attention by qualified veterans? To neglect these courses of action, which could be construed as the equivalent of fraud, waste, and abuse to the veteran, not only cost the American taxpayer a tidy sum, but place an additional social and emotional burden on our nation's returning wounded, their families, and particularly those with varying levels of TBI and other injuries. Montana has a very challenging geography that already makes sustained access to care difficult. But to compound these issues with gross incompetence, neglect, and cutting corners is a tremendous disservice to our veterans perpetrated by staff at Fort Harrison and other regional offices. Ladies and gentlemen, this needs to be corrected, and this needs to be corrected immediately. To bring attention to the severity and potential criminal nature of these acts, I will briefly highlight several observations within the Montana, Salt Lake, Denver VA offices and how their collusive interactions have led me to be sitting here before you today. Within the Montana VA, physicians are knowingly operating outside the scope of their licenses, which results in the intentional and systematic lowering of the quality care and disability ratings. As an example, one such clinician, Robert J. Bettine, PhD, made clinical conclusions outside the scope of his expertise. In the eyes of the VA, this is acceptable. However, he was found in violation of several tenets of his license by his peers at the Montana State Board of Psychologists. When Dr. Trina Bondi, the medical chief of staff, was approached with this subjective and factual information along with a request for formal and informal reviews, the veteran, myself, was referred to a VA attorney. I ask you, is this how we treat wounded vets? Substandard care and the argument that the VA is immune to state oversight, ethics, and administrative policies? Sadly, this type of behavior and disregard for patients and veterans are common occurrences within the Fort Harrison system. When veterans must be proactive and seek administrative recourse to correct injustices, they are ignored and told they are attacking the VA. When I ask to see an MD to administer a proper diagnosis, why am I referred to a VA regional counsel, Jeff Stacy? When veterans seek recourse through varying levels of leadership and appointed directorships such as Willie Clark and John Skelly, why are they referred to legal counsel? All of which I might add are in direct violation of internal VA policy, federal code, and rules set forth by the Office of Regulation and Policy Management. When I speak with regional counsel to seek clarification and get a conference call between the VBA and the VHA to sort of figure out what's going on, I'm told that I'm disingenuous and faking my injury. Is this how the system operates? For all intents and purposes, I have just outlined fraud, waste, and abuse on individual level there, and there remains to be no accountability. I bring this up in hope of clarifying my position with this epidemic that's going on. Now consider this, and I'll be very brief. Montana has the second highest VA population in the United States, roughly 10%. Couple that with a very unique population distribution and challenging geography, and you'll see why the transparency and accountability with respect to resources and care become evident. Thank you, Honorable Chairman, and esteemed members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak on behalf of not only servicemen and women in uniform, but retirees, honorably discharged vets, concerned citizens, and mostly especially caregivers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you both, and Captain Gatlin, thank you again for your service. Mr. Anderson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is David Anderson. I'm from the Akima Atum tribe, other known as Gila River Indian Community. I'm a 20-year veteran. I'm also a American Legion Post Commander within the Gila River Indian Community. I'm also a founder and chairperson for Atum veterans. As you know, Native Americans as a whole were the largest minority in the armed forces, but we're the least amount utilizing our VA benefits. Now, saying that, the VA does help us out. I mean, they've come a long way in the last 10 years with people like Phyllis Spears here in the Tucson VA, Mike Leone in the Phoenix office has helped me tremendously over the last 4 years trying to get Native Americans signed up for veterans benefits. I'm saying that also there are, I guess I don't want to say that there's only problems there, because there are good people here in the VA. So I'd like to say that. Sorry. Like I said, I received a TBI in 1987 when nobody knew what a TBI was. Got promoted to E7 in 7 years. I was at the top of the Army, 1% of the Army on my career progression. But after I got a TBI, I was on every urinalysis after so. You know, everybody didn't know what was going on. Everybody was like, oh, he's on drugs. Well, you know, when you go to that super soldier and you're on that downward spiral, people didn't know. And I'm glad that we are looking at this to help our veterans. But at saying that, 22 veterans die every day in the United States. We are more suicides than what we have lost in Afghan and Iraq, which is a sad thing to say. When I got out in 2000, I started through the VA process in 2003. Going through that process with my mental health giver, you know, right off the bat, the VA wants to give you drugs. You know, instead of dealing with the situation, I was sleeping 18 hours a day, and when I was told, I said, I don't want to sleep 18 hours a day. I'm getting more depressed. I'm falling, I feel like I'm falling off that, what I already had. You know, and my comments, their comments was to me was, well, either take these drugs or we're done here. Of course, I had, you know, PTSD, TBI, and I said, okay, I guess we're done here. You know, and through my faith and my tribe and other veterans, you know, I've fought that and somewhat recovered. I mean, from alcoholism to fighting with the police, getting thrown in jail. I mean, I went through that whole gambit of troubles that we see our young veterans going through. I said, I counsel young veterans on a daily basis, you know, and I see that the problems that we're having. I have one veteran that said he had talked about hurting himself. So he got a one-way trip to here. You know, they took him off the gurney, strapped him down and gave him drugs, pushed him in a room with 12 other people. You know, there is no crisis management within the VA to deal with these situations. And I guess that's my whole deal, is that, because PTSD is not a new disease or a new anything within the U.S. services. I mean, our native tribes, and when we went away to battle, you could not come back to the village for 3 to 5 days until you got cleansed, until you got all of this out. It's nothing new, but the VA does not cure people, they medicate people. And that's where we need to look at our professional services in there and to get away from those drugs and to really deal with the problem here. And I guess, and that's what I'm here to say is, you know, we need to outsource those problems. I'm trying to get a MOU with our tribal hospital and the VA, which the VA is, in pamphlets have said, oh yeah, this is the best thing since sliced white bread. But they only want to pay for in-source kind. All tribal hospitals are small in size. We outsource things. We don't have a cardiologist. We don't have a bone specialist. We outsource them. But the VA is still not willing to pay for those outsourcing. We don't have the time to, like these people are saying, to get these people proper medical treatment without the outsourcing. We can't send them to the VA because they'll never be seen. And that's why we're looking to outsource our Native American veterans to get the proper treatment. And I guess I would look at this committee for help on that, because as veterans, like I said, we're the largest minority in the armed forces. And this is what we need, is to be able to outsource and to help our veterans as we all know, most Native American communities are alcohol and drug abuse, which is not helping our veterans. But I think if we are allowed to outsource them, to give them the proper treatment, that as Native Americans go, I think we would be a lot better off than trying to send them to a veterans hospital where there is no help. They're overburdened, they're overbooked. I mean, I come from the Casa Grande office, and I know I'm out of time, but I come from the Casa Grande office. We had one doctor for over 5,000 patients. We had 2 more doctors come in. I got to see my new doctor. He was there for 3 weeks and then left. I have no idea who my new doctor is, or have I ever seen him, because the snowbirds are here. And, you know, getting an appointment when they're here is non-attainable. And like I'd like to say, on my family side, my father put in 26 years. I have 2 brothers. All 3 of us retired from the military. My son just graduated AIT at Fort Huachuca, and he's going to Colorado, Fort Carson, 10th Special Forces Group. So, and saying that, I thank the committee for letting me address you. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Anderson, thank you so much for your service, the service of your family. Mr. Bowles, you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Kaufman, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, and members of the committee. My name is Jerry Bowles, and I am the director of Rock Soldiers for Wounded Warrior nonprofit. Here in Arizona, we service wounded warriors here in Arizona. Anyways, the testimony I'm gonna give today is the first time I've spoken openly about my personal experiences concerning this issue. But in 1989, I was stationed in the U.S. Army at Fort Riley, Kansas. During my time there, I was attacked by 3 male soldiers, grabbed and pulled into a room. I was forcibly held down by 2 of the males, while 1 forcibly raped me. I was then raped by the 2nd male. The 3rd male did not do anything except hold me while this was going on. I was told that if I said anything, I would be killed. I was in so much pain and shock that basically I was dragged to the stairs and was thrown down a flight of stairs, 20 stairs, and left alone. I passed out and woke up by the cadre. I could not move, so they sent me to the hospital on base. I became paralyzed emotionally, which I literally had to have a cattle prod taken, pressed on my feet to bring me out of the paralysis condition. At this time, I was so ashamed about what had happened that I did not report this incident, and even told my father that I had slipped down some stairs and broke my arm. I'd spent several days in the hospital for this incident, no one knowing that I'd been raped. In 1990, I was discharged from the Army, so for the next 16 years, I kept this to myself. I was married, had 3 children, and one night, because of a nightmare, something snapped within me. The nightmares became so bad that I could not sleep, and literally I was a walking zombie for not allowing myself to sleep. Finally, after 6 years, I started seeing a nurse practitioner, counselor at the Sholo VA. I told her my story, and after a year, she left, and I had to see someone else. I would have to start all over again, which I just couldn't do. So after about a year and a half, my wife encouraged me to seek help once again. I was really wanting to talk to a male doctor. I was really not wanting to talk to a male doctor about my experiences. I wasn't getting any better, so I did go back to the VA. I saw a physician, Dr. Davis. He could prescribe medications, so I continued to see Dr. Davis for almost 2 years. This was one-on-one counseling visits. This time, I was recommended by Dr. Davis to submit for PTSD, depression, unemployability, which he documented, and I can also add that in his notes, he related the military sexual trauma. I was denied PTSD related from the male sexual trauma due to lack of evidence. However, I was service-connected for depression 100%, temporary to be reevaluated after 2 years. I was originally denied Social Security disability twice, which took over another 2 years to get that approved through the use of a lawyer. This was because I could not work and was already diagnosed as chronic depression by the Veterans Administration. I lost my family. I found myself living in a cabin as a recluse in Show Low almost 2 years. Before the cabin, I lived in a room in my ex-wife's home, which I shut myself in and went out only after people were not around. I shopped at Walmart at 2 a.m. in the morning, so I didn't have to see people. I would go fishing at daybreak before anyone would be there. In August of 2010, my son, serving in the Army, had been wounded in Afghanistan, broke his neck, shattered his leg. I spent from August 2010 to November 2010 at Brooke Army Medical Center during my son's recovery. It was just me there with him. We had a lot of time to talk, but one of the last things he said to me during these conversations was, "Dad, promise me that you go seek help," which I did after returning to Show Low, and I contacted the Tucson VA. Not the Phoenix VA, the Tucson VA. I requested to make arrangements to get into the inpatient substance abuse program. February 2011 was the quickest time that I could go there, which I did. I stayed inpatient for 3 months and finally able to get into the military sexual inpatient group, which is a 1-year program. So after being inpatient for 3 months at the VA Medical Center, I then left and would live in Casa Grande. I would commute once a week to Tucson for my group sessions. I did this for 9 months. The group counseling was very intense, starting with a group of 8 male veterans ranging from the Korean War, Vietnam, and current war. We ended with 3 finishing the program due to the intensity and having to relive the actual experiences. Currently today, I see a therapist at the VA CBOC clinic in Casa Grande, averaging every 2 weeks since October of 2013. I've submitted 3 times to the Veterans Administration for PTSD related to the military sexual trauma. I've been denied 3 times because of lack of evidence. I did not speak up when this rape occurred. I was too ashamed. I want to acknowledge the Veterans Administration for finally recognizing that military sexual trauma is and has been an ongoing problem. However, being recognized is one thing, not being service connected and compensated with benefits is another. This feels that it is a slap in the face like it never happened. If it is only being recognized for treatment, then the VA is only putting a Band-Aid on the problem. I am speaking for all male veterans who are going through these difficult experiences of military sexual trauma, as well as females too. I realize that military sexual trauma is very difficult for anyone to talk about, but more and more we are now seeing these experiences come out in the limelight. What is needed now? We need fair evaluation of personal stressors and physician diagnoses to service connect and give our veterans benefits what they deserve and most important need. I would like to also comment on the veteran access to medical care, especially in the rural areas, based on my experiences. I want to first bring up that when I was in the military sexual trauma program for the 9 months in outpatient, I had to drive 70 miles one way to attend sessions, Casa Grande to Tucson. This is 140 miles round trip. Even today, to continue the military sexual trauma individual or group counseling, I would still have to drive that distance. The program is good. The distance is not for any veteran in this situation. I might add, even in Show Low, if it was to see a specialist for my knee or shoulder, I would have to travel to Phoenix, which was almost 400 miles round trip. Living in a rural area, I would like to see more specialists and physicians that can do immediate care, not having veterans constantly trying to get appointments. I recently had to deal with the same problem.
Mr. Bowles, please, you're over time. Please sum up. Thank you.
I would like to see a fully staffed VA clinic and maintain that VA staff to assure myself and all veterans quality health care in a reasonable time frame. I also recommend a vet center in this area that veterans can go to and seek counseling for PTSD, TBI, and sexual trauma and concerns related to these issues. It is important to me, and I know it is important to every veteran living in the Casa Grande Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Bowles. Thank you for your service. Mr. Davison, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Honorable Chairman Kaufman, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, Ms. Sinema. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm here representing my son, Lance Clinton Davison, who is deceased, who we lost recently, just before sunrise on Sunday, February 9th. He succumbed to his wounds that he received in 2 wars, Afghanistan and Iraq in the Middle East, and he took his life. I've submitted written testimony to the subcommittee with addendums that appropriately characterize and honor my son and his service to his country. But in the few minutes that I have, I wanted to read a letter that Lance had written in his defense to the Superior Court of Maricopa County about 2 years ago. And I think it pretty well sums up his circumstance and his frustration with not only with the military and the VA, but also with himself. So I will read that now. My name is Lance Davison. I am writing and petitioning to have my judgment set aside or vacated, also to reinstate my right to bear arms for employment purposes. I understand the initial severity and the potential of my actions on the night in question. It changed my life and deeply affected others. However, I contend this incident is a result of psychological stress from years of service to my country and community. I am a United States Marine in a special operations unit known as MARSOC, Marine Special Operations Command, with 9 years of service and multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. I was decorated multiple times for my actions in combat. I was formerly a police officer with citations for my actions in line of duty. For nearly 7 years, my country asked me to perform acts of violence on its behalf. I have lived and experienced life well outside the normal human condition. I firmly believe there exists a mental threshold that each man owns. I may have spanned by. I developed a condition commonly referred to as PTSD. Years in combat zones have left me wounded both physically and psychologically. I have witnessed war on a very personal level, even become comfortable with it. When I returned home, I was diagnosed with PTSD and immediately placed on drugs in my best interest. My wife at the time was concerned that I had changed and maybe the drugs would help. Post-traumatic stress was amplified after a shootout as a police officer in which I nearly lost my life again. By no fault of the professionals at the Veterans Administration, I was kept on a regimen of drugs that have psychotropic properties, drugs I have found I was very sensitive to. The questioning of drugs, the administering of drugs started after my last deployment after I sustained injuries in combat. These drugs were DOD approved. However, upon my discharge from the Marines, I was given another set of drugs through the Veterans Administration. Each regional hospital has its own formularies or set of drugs doctors administer. So the experimentation began to find a cocktail that doesn't upset my mental chemistry. So when I moved from the Northern Arizona healthcare system to the Phoenix Regional Healthcare System, I was administered a new cocktail of sleep aids, antidepressants, and drugs that classify as psychotropic. By the time I was finally pulled off the drugs and it was deemed that I was too chemically sensitive, I had 32 different cocktails, 32 different combinations of drugs. The circumstances I found myself in was that I never had a consistent care provider. People would leave and move on to other jobs, so there was no safety net. Episodes would occur and it was always attributed to PTSD. No one immediately examined the pharmaceuticals. On some level, PTSD was a major factor, but there was these drugs that were constantly changing. The dosages would increase, other drugs would be added until I could barely function. I was taken off the drugs after there was concern that TBI, traumatic brain injury, may be causing some of the symptoms. After 6 years of being on medication, I stopped. That was February 8, 2011. No one fully knows the effect of these pills on an individual with blast injuries. There's also a condition called serotonin syndrome. Like any other drug, a detox period is needed. I had severe withdrawal. My mind was frayed. In no other state would I ever burn my porch and driven my truck into a pool. I was hallucinating and was simply reliving my time in Iraq, 2003. I experienced a dissociative episode that involved my brain's inability to produce serotonin and other regulating chemicals. I urge you to read the medical records provided. I was drinking, and for that, immediately the onus shifts. I was attempting to alleviate my symptoms in the kaleidoscopic mental circus. I have taken responsibility for my actions and poor decision to self-medicate with alcohol. I have taken responsibility for handling my situation and my condition poorly. I went above the court's recommendation and spent 50 days in an inpatient PTSD and alcohol treatment program. However, just like in combat, there are no right answers. You just search for the best answer. This incident wasn't born of malice or criminal intent, just an unfortunate sequence of events and an old broken Marine trying to make sense of it all. I ask the court to vacate or set aside the judgment and reinstate my right to bear arms so I can continue with my profession. Move forward as a successful, functioning, and contributing individual. Thank you for your time and consideration. So from that point on, Lance took charge of his life. He created his own disabled veteran-owned business and was doing well. And we were all very blindsided by the tragedy that struck him because we thought he had been making such positive improvement. But it's obvious, as you can see, his past was very problematic. So I hope that the subcommittee will take these issues very serious, and the best way to honor Lance and military personnel like him, veterans that have PTSD and TBI, is to correct the problem, and so that no other young men or women have to make this choice. Because I do believe that Lance's character is firm, and that he just didn't want to become what it was making him. So he had to make a choice. Thank you.
Mr. Davidson, thank you so much for your testimony and for the service of your son, and I'm very sorry for your loss. Mr. Hazel, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Kaufman, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, Representative Sinema. Thank you very much for having me here today. I served in the Marine Corps from 1999 to 2005, where I served 2 tours in Iraq. During my second tour in Iraq as an infantry squad leader, my squad was hit by two IEDs, the second of which killed 1 of my Marines and wounded 3, myself included. Upon returning to the States, I resumed life and returned to a civilian job. I had already started to struggle with PTSD symptoms. Within a year of being home, I had gotten to the point where I was self-medicating with alcohol daily. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that I could no longer deal with these issues myself, and one night I called the Veterans Crisis Line. The following day, I went to the closest VA clinic, which was located in Alexandria, Virginia. I was extremely fortunate. Due to my desperation, the VA counselor saw me that day, even though I had not yet been enrolled in the VA system. I began weekly sessions with the counselor and had monthly appointments with a psychiatrist. Eventually, I agreed to be treated at an inpatient facility located in Martinsburg, West Virginia. First, I was treated for alcohol abuse, then I was treated for PTSD. Unfortunately, due to the intense emotions that accompanied the PTSD program, I withdrew myself and returned to work. Within a year, I decided to return home to Arizona, where I moved to Phoenix. I was given a 3-month supply of medications with instructions to enroll in the VA healthcare system upon my return. Upon arriving in Arizona, I immediately began to look for work. I had 2 jobs, both of which lasted 2 months. I ran out of medication and attempted to manage my PTSD on my own. After being without medication for over a month, I became emotionally distraught and finally enrolled in the Phoenix VA healthcare system. When I attempted to make an appointment to be seen by a psychiatrist so I could resume my medication, I was informed that I had to wait at least a month, if not longer. At this point, I had already been without medication for 2 months. I pleaded with the hospital to see if they could at least refill my prescriptions that I had when I had been living in the DC area. The Phoenix VA hospital solution was to treat me inpatient at their mental health ward. This only made matters worse. Within 3 days, I demanded to be released and signed myself out of the hospital. The doctor refused to put me on the same medication, stating that some of the medications were not in the Phoenix VA healthcare system's formula. After leaving the mental health ward in Phoenix, I moved in with my mother in Casa Grande. Living in Casa Grande, I was now in the jurisdiction of the Southern Arizona VA healthcare system. My experience has been much better since. I was seen within 2 weeks by a psychiatrist at the Tucson VA hospital and started therapy with a counselor at the Casa Grande community-based outpatient clinics. The Southern Arizona VA healthcare system fell under yet another formula, and they were able to put me on the same medications that I was on while I was living in DC. Over several years, my medication was decreased, and I vastly improved. Unfortunately, PTSD hits in waves. I missed the anniversary date from an incident in Iraq during which several Marines from my unit were killed. This sent me into a severe depressive episode. I canceled my appointments with my counselor and my psychiatrist. After several months of this depressive episode, I eventually tried to take my own life by overdosing on a 3-month supply of sleeping pills. I woke several days later in an intensive care unit and was then transferred to the Tucson VA mental health ward, where I stayed for several weeks. Prior to discharge, a safety plan was implemented, and I was placed on a high-risk list with the VA healthcare system. That being said, when I was discharged and I first tried to make a counseling appointment when I left the hospital, I was told that it would be several weeks until I could be seen. When I informed the receptionist about my recent hospitalization, she saw the flag in the system, and I was seen several days later. I remained on the high-risk list for several months until my mental health care providers deemed that I was safe to be taken off. Since that time, I began working as a veterans advocate, helping veterans navigate the Veterans Benefits Administration, and to this day, I am still treated by the Southern Arizona VA healthcare system. Thank you very much for your time.
Mr. Hazel, thank you so much for your service to the United States Marine Corps, to this country, and we'll begin our round of questions. Captain Gatlin, you were examined by 3 Department of Defense physicians over the course of 3 years and received a 70% disability rating for mild TBI when you were medically retired. How do you explain the 10% rating by the Veterans Administration?
Honestly, I can't. I'm still just up in the air with it. I can't believe it. The way the VA works, I think with the C&P exam is you have, I think it's an hour video that you watch, and you have some post-back questions on the internet. We could all take it right now, and we could all see patients, because you don't have to have a license to do it. I think that's a huge issue, first and foremost. 2, I think that the VA, and I can't really speak to the larger picture, just the Montana Helena VA, the Fort Harrison VA, they're systematically and intentionally lowering ratings. They're using faulty tests, and they know it. Hopefully that will come out a little bit later. And 3, I think it's this. You know, we all watch sports, I guess, to some extent, and if you've ever keep up with the NFL, it's changing. You know, you got head concussion rules coming out there now. The kickoff's been moved. They're toying around moving the extra point, which I'm totally against, by the way. But when you look at the VA, with the quality of soldiers coming back, some of their socioeconomic, geopolitical problems, some of the other things, the VA's got to change. I mean, I don't know when these rules were put in place, but they've got to change. They're not progressive. And they're so dug in. When you come in to get them, they tell you that you're attacking them. I mean, what is a young soldier, let's say 18 to 22 years old, TBI is a secondary injury behind, shall we say, a more primary life-threatening injury. Married couple, kids, live in the middle of nowhere, Montana. What are they going to do? I mean, maybe they don't have the initiative or sort of the attitude that I have sometimes. I get criticized for it a lot, to be able to come forward and stand up for themselves and stand up for others. So what they're doing, Congressman, is they're systematically lowering ratings and keeping their fingers crossed that nobody says anything about it.
Mr. Duplessis, VA has proposed a diminished funding for TBI treatment. Please describe the Wounded Warrior Project's reaction to this proposal, if there is a position.
We just simply are asking, like I said in the testimony, to make sure that Congress, we've already enacted the law, so just enforce the law. Like I said in the testimony, with someone suffering from a TBI, I had a severe TBI, other warriors have had severe TBIs, and they use the word plateau. We just don't, personally, I just don't believe in that word. With someone with a TBI, the brain is the most complex organ in the body. I think it's hard for a doctor or a clinician to say someone has plateaued when that warrior inside knows they have not plateaued. And what's to say, too, that that warrior has gone through, step by step by step help, and we stop it, and what's to say that warrior will not digress?
Ms. Del Negro, can you briefly describe I guess it's R-bands, and I understand that's repeatable battery for the Association of Neuropsychological Status. R-bands assessment tool and how it was misused during the CMP examination. Do you know if it's been used elsewhere?
I'm not a medical professional, but I do dabble a little in the medical arena. My familiarity with R-bands was non-existent prior to this experience, and it was only upon us bringing it to the attention of the Board of Psychologists that we learned, in fact, that R-bands is a diagnostic, or it's a screening test that's primarily used for dementia in the elderly. It has been studied in various different, very small studies for its application to evaluate cognitive dysfunction in other disease states such as Alzheimer's, and on moderate and severe brain injury as well. But the results are not well established enough to be making firm generalizations about their routine use in practice. The psychologists who used the test, my impression in speaking with the system is that the test was not endorsed by the system CPEP training, as my husband was mentioning before. Rather, however, despite the fact that he used this test and used it inappropriately, even, for instance, the results of the testing actually confirmed what my husband's complaints were, but he disregarded those test results and attributed any sort of complaints of cognitive disorder to PTSD. And so it was just profoundly unprofessional all around, but the R-bands is being used or has been used previously at I believe it was the Texas VA, and that was at the admission of the psychologist in question, who issued in his statement that this was a test that had been used in other VAs, and his immediate supervisors condoned the test. They said he followed protocol.
Thank you. Ranking Member Kirkpatrick?
Thank you all for your testimony and for being here today. I have a question for each one of you. I want to hear this from each one of you. We know there are multiple problems in the system, but in an effort to move forward in a positive way after today's hearing, I'd just like to ask each one of you, what would be the number one thing the VA could have done to make a difference in your experience? And Mr. Hazel, we'll start with you.
Whenever veterans move from one area to another, the VA doesn't keep track of them. When I moved from DC to Phoenix, it would have been nice if there would have been something set in place to automatically transfer my file so I could have resumed receiving treatment immediately. Additionally, all the hospitals operate on their own independent system. As a result, none of them use the same criteria for how they prescribe medication. So once again, veterans have to start from scratch. Thank you.
Mr. Davison.
I just wanted to say that I think that one of the primary things that the VA needs to do is we need to have a complete and thorough investigation, review, and evaluation, and an updated strategy to deal with PTS and TBI. It's the signature medical condition for OEF and OIF veterans, and that only through that kind of evaluation and scrutiny can we're learning new things every day in science and technology, and I think that just hasn't been applied yet. And we're really doing old school type things to deal with the veterans' problems, and we need to come up to speed to the 21st century.
Mr. Bowles?
For me, it would be keeping our rural area CBOCs 100% staffed and maintaining that 100% staffing. And even at 100% staffing, in certain departments, such as the Casa Grande CBOC's physical therapy department, it's not staffed near enough with only one person to accommodate the needs of all of our veterans recovering from major joint surgeries in Pinal County, let alone all the other physical therapy needs our veterans need.
Mr. Anderson?
A big part where that would be is don't start off with a big mixture of drugs. Start off at a smaller dose. If they need a little bit more, then go from there. Don't start at the top and go from there, because then they want more and more. Also, I would like to see them utilize those veterans that are at a certain level of recovery from TBIs or PTSD, similar to the AA, where you have another veteran that you can call that understands your problems, that understands what you're going through. Utilize those people. Have a buddy system where he can call and you could talk it about it instead of getting strapped to a chair and shoved in a room and given drugs. One more deal on that is, we have a lot of service members that got dishonorably discharged that aren't eligible for veterans care. And a lot of that is PTSD. What about those soldiers? I mean, sir, Mr. Chairman, you've been in the service. You know that you've seen those guys come back after conflict and get into trouble, whether it be DUIs, alcohol abuse, spousal abuse, domestic violence, where they're dishonorably discharged from the service. That's like having a felony on your record. Those people also need to be looked at and taken care of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have a few more minutes. I'll quickly go through the last three. Captain Gatlin.
Leadership, honesty, transparency, accountability. When you have a problem, maybe it's not a problem yet. At what point does tier level 1 leadership step down and kind of see what's going on? Kind of like a general walking amongst the privates. Hey, what's going on? The private feels better. The general has firsthand feedback to what's going on. The VA just plays the VBA against the VHA. I don't know if you've ever read John Grisham's The Rainmaker with the Great Benefits, but that's the VA. That's how they operate. And if you don't have the initiative or the resources, you get pushed out, you get frustrated, and all these things that these gentlemen were just talking about start to occur. So leadership, honesty, transparency, accountability by senior echelon leadership.
Thank you. Yes.
I think that was very well stated in terms of picking which option I wanted to go with. I think I would just say that the system doesn't care or is not aware of the stresses that it's being placed upon the family. And when you have a veteran who has a TBI and then the emotional, with emotional underlying issues, then the stresses from that situation are compounded, and that can affect the family members and the caregivers, and the burden the system is placing on those families is ridiculous. And so I wish that they had been able to acknowledge that and address it accordingly.
Thank you. Mr. DePlisi.
My experience at the Tucson VA has been exemplary, but for warriors, veterans outside of Tucson, I ask that Congress enforce the TBI law for lifetime care and give effective and timely care for mental health issues such as PTSD, depression, anxiety, and warriors that exhibit suicidal ideations.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for extending my time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Congresswoman Sinema, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Kaufman and Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, for allowing me to participate today and for holding this hearing in Arizona. Chairman Kaufman, thank you for coming to our state. We have a very proud military tradition here in Arizona, and this issue is important to all of us. And Congresswoman Kirkpatrick, you're a great champion for Arizona veterans, so I'm glad that you brought the committee here to Arizona to hear directly from veterans. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your service to our country, your sacrifice, your family sacrifice, and for your advocacy and courage to stand up for all of our nation's veterans. I believe it's critical that our veterans have access to appropriate care. Traumatic brain injuries, mental health wounds are the signature wounds of the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, but previous generations of our country's warriors also have these wounds. And as was noted by the panel, we lose 22 veterans a day to suicide. It's unacceptable. I'm also extremely disturbed by recent allegations about the Phoenix VA Medical Center in my district that delays in care may have caused the deaths of upwards of 40 Arizona veterans. We must get to the bottom of this and hold accountable those who are responsible. I think that no veteran should ever feel like he or she has no place to turn, and no family should lose their loved one after he or she returns home. My first question is for Mr. DePlisi, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Davison. You each testified to either your own experience or the experience of your son, who developed a relationship with a VA professional only for that employee to leave, and for the veteran to have little or no warning, forcing them into an either start over period or in some cases without any care at all for an acceptable period of time. We know that many PTSD and TBI patients don't have a reliable safety net. There was a veteran in my district, Daniel Summers, who committed suicide last summer. He had post-traumatic stress disorder and a traumatic brain injury. He was first placed into group therapy, which was not an effective place for someone who served in classified service. Later, his VA professional left with no warning, and with nowhere to turn, he committed suicide. My question for each of you who either yourself or your family member have experienced something similar, do you have a suggestion of what the VA could do differently to ensure that veterans like yourself and your son are not left in a situation without the mental health care professional who they formed a bond with and who they trust? Mr. Davison, Mr. Bowles, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Duplessis, feel free, any of you, to answer.
I think a critical component is to engage local communities. This would also be a cost-effective way to mitigate these problems for our VAs. If they worked with local veteran service organizations and communities, and we all got involved, and the VA would consider outsourcing these type of, and at least partially fund these type of efforts, I think it'll bring it home for veterans. I know in my community, there is a lot of veterans with PTSD, and what happened to Lance was what touched them deeply, and it was very tragic, and it shook them up, and they're starting to say, we've got to do something for ourselves. So if the VA will look at partnering with local VSOs and community groups and working together, because it's not just the VA's problem. It's not just the United States military problem. It's our problem as a nation. And it's our duty, it's your moral obligation as leaders and government officials to fulfill the promises that we've made to veterans. But it's also our duty as citizens and former veterans to come together to help them. Because like you mentioned, 22 a day, it's a national tragedy, and it's an epidemic that has extreme ramifications for the military and for our nation. It's just, you said it, it's unacceptable. We cannot allow this to continue.
Thank you. Mr. Bowles.
For me, Congressman Sinema, for me and my personal experience, I've seen over 5 healthcare providers and each one of them, the reason why I've seen them is because one left, and so I had to see another. It was hard for me to talk to males, number one. So for me, the providers looking at the charts and reading up on the charts and knowing the patients, talking to the previous provider, knowing that this gentleman is not comfortable in certain situations, to maintaining staffing, and 3, again, it is so imperative. For me, in the role, all my care for the last 24 years, I've been in the Tucson VA system, which has been great, and I've been in the Phoenix VA healthcare system. And it is, the rural healthcare system is so understaffed for the care that is needed. Telemed, for me, I cannot do telemed, and that is provided. It is not a one-to-one conducive to speak about. So that is not an option for me. So I'm looking at 140 miles if I want to continue care, and I do the best I can. But staffing, reviewing the charts, knowing the patient. This gentleman's not going to be comfortable with a male, and yet that's who I get, and so I stop. And so that would be my suggestions.
Okay, and I pretty much on those same symptoms. Like I said, my first healthcare provider or physical, she basically told me when I first started was from Monday at 8 o'clock till Friday at 5 o'clock, that's when she was on the clock. because I asked her to review some psychological tests that I received. And talking to that psychologist in Phoenix, he was all like, it was supposed to be an hour-and-a-half test. It turned out to be 6 hours. You know, because he kept giving me these tests, and he goes, oh, and he was telling me stuff about my life that made so much sense. And I was like, and he goes, well, I'm contracted through the VA. I can't really treat you, or this is kind of crossing the line there. Get with your healthcare provider. So that was sent to her on Friday. I had an appointment with her on Monday. I was all excited to see her. And she goes, well, I didn't review that because I don't work on the weekends. And, you know, it was that type of attitude that just kind of shot me down. And then, like you were saying, the teledoc, I mean, he doesn't care. I mean, okay, well, you know what? You don't want to take my meds? Then, you know what? We're done here. So we stopped. You know, and the big problem I see is that when we do have, especially our young soldiers, and I speak a lot for our young soldiers, when they come in there and they have a problem, most of them have young families. And if they're alcohol, drugs, you know, got out of the military, having trouble at home, because that's what PTS does. You know, all those little problems keep piling up, and you're digging that hole, and you're digging that hole. And it takes the VA so long to recognize it and to try to get them some help, whether it be psychological or financial. You know, and meanwhile, that guy is going to China. He's digging his hole, and it's going deep. And there's a lot of problems out there with our younger veterans, and we're not doing nothing about it.
Thank you.
You know.
Thank you.
Well, I have to say the VA is a very complex system, and problems with mental health care are also very complex. And there's no silver bullet or cure-all for these issues. But for me, it comes down to staffing, and it also comes down to the accessibility of the mental health care here at the VA. You have to have invested, proven staff that are invested in helping veterans, helping warriors with mental health issues. Here at the Tucson VA, I've been very fortunate to have that since I came here in 2008, but it's not the same everywhere. I came here and I had one mental health clinician. Then I went to another one, and they were very accommodating because I was working during the day. I couldn't make the appointments. I asked if they had a plan in place where they could help me to come after hours, and they did have a clinician who accommodated that, and I greatly benefited from that counseling that I received. And actually, it lowered my severe PTSD to mild PTSD from a 50% down to 10%. So I am proof that the system does work, again, here in Tucson, Arizona, but it's not the same everywhere. Tucson's the model, and it's an exception, but all VAs should be just like Tucson.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Panel, I'd like to thank you so much for your testimony today, for the service to to this country, and for members of your family that have served this country. Ranking Member.
Thank you for your selfless courage in coming today and testifying. You've made history. You've helped the committee give us some direction and how to move forward. So thank you from the bottom of my heart very much.
I now would like to invite the second panel to come up to the witness table. And again, thank you very much. On our second panel, we will hear from Dr. Lisa Kearney, Senior Consultant for National Mental Health Technical Assistance of the Office of Mental Health Operations, Veterans Health Administration. She's accompanied by Dr. Joe Schulten, National Director of Special Projects for Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation Services, Veterans Health Administration. Mr. Jonathan Gardner, Director of Southern Arizona VA Healthcare System. Mr. Joshua Redlin, licensed clinical social worker and team leader for the Tucson Vet Center. And Mr. Rod Sepulveda, did I say it? Sepulveda? Close? Rod Sepulveda, Rural Health Program Manager of the Northern Arizona VA Healthcare System. Dr. Kearney, your complete written statement will be made part of the hearing record, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. First, I'd like to express our appreciation for the first panel. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. And especially, I'm very appreciative of the feedback that they all gave to you, ma'am. And we have taken notes on that, and we'll be following up on that. But we very much appreciate that. And to Mr. Davison in particular, our hearts go out to you. Chairman Kaufman, Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss access to treatment for veterans with traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder once they returned home. I am joined today by Dr. Joel Schulten, Special Projects Director for the Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation Program, Mr. Jonathan H. Gardner, Medical Center Director at the Southern Arizona VA Healthcare System, Mr. Joshua Redlin, Team Leader at the Tucson Vet Center, and Mr. Rod Sepulveda, Rural Health Program Coordinator for the Northern Arizona VA Healthcare System. VHA provides state-of-the-art comprehensive health care and support services for veterans with both combat and civilian-related TBI through the polytrauma system of care. Through this program, the department continues to advance the evaluation, treatment, and understanding of TBI in a variety of ways by, one, developing and implementing best clinical practices for TBI, two, collaborating with strategic partners, including veterans' families and caregivers, veterans service organizations, the Department of Defense, and other government agencies, community rehabilitation providers, and academic affiliates. By providing education and training in TBI-related care and rehabilitation, and finally by conducting research and translating findings into improved clinical care. This system is designed to assist veterans with TBI and polytrauma in a seamless transition between the Department of Defense and VHA. It also assists a veteran with their transition back to their home community through the provision of evidence-based rehabilitation services and care coordination. VA is one of the largest integrated healthcare systems in the United States that provides specialized mental health treatment for PTSD. In fiscal year 13, over 530,000 veterans received treatment for PTSD in VA medical centers and clinics. VA provides care for PTSD in a variety of settings delivered by more than 5,200 VA mental health providers who have received training in the most effective known treatments for PTSD. VA also operates a National Center for PTSD that provides research, consultation, and education to clinicians, veterans, family members, and researchers. The National PTSD Mentoring Program, which works with every specialty PTSD program across the country, is designed to promote evidence-based practice within the VA. Southern Arizona VA serves as a polytrauma network site in VISN 18 and coordinates key components of post-acute rehabilitation care for individuals with polytrauma and TBI across the VISN. Since 2010, the facility has seen a 70% increase in TBI and polytrauma visits completed via telehealth, with veterans residing in rural and highly rural areas, making up as much as 37% of the overall telerehabilitation workload in fiscal year 13. Southern Arizona has also worked closely with community partners to develop multidimensional programs such as the Adaptive Sports Program, the VISN 18 program for managing veterans with complex pain, a vision therapy clinic, and the headache management clinic. Southern Arizona's VA's Polytrauma Network site also engages with the Arizona Governor's Council on spinal and head injuries, the Arizona Coalition for Military Families, the University of Arizona, Pima Community College, the Arizona Department of Economic Security, and others to better serve the vocational rehabilitation goals of injured veterans. On August 14th, 2013, Southern Arizona VA hosted a mental health summit with over 90 community participants. Southern Arizona VA will be hosting another mental health summit in August with a focus on mental health access. Southern Arizona VA provides comprehensive mental health services, which also includes primary care mental health integration. This program supports primary care PAC by providing a mental health psychiatrist and a team of social workers who are co-located in the primary care clinics. In fiscal year 13, this program served over 5,000 unique patients with nearly 16,000 clinical encounters. In addition to providing a wide range of social and psychological services to eligible veterans, service members, and families, the Tucson Vet Center also provides community outreach, education, and coordination of services with community agencies. In closing, first let me apologize. Congresswoman Cinnamon, I did not recognize you earlier. We're glad that you're here today. VHA provides comprehensive health care and support services for veterans with both combat and civilian-related TBI and PTSD. VHA is continually working to further enhance these services through quality improvement initiatives, and we're grateful for the support of Congress and our community partners to assist us in these endeavors. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. At this time, my colleagues and I are pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony. Dr. Kearney, the administration's budget request for FY fiscal year 2015 is for $229 million for TBI medical programs, down 1.3% from fiscal year 2014, the current year. In light of this reduction, how will VA ensure that veterans with TBI receive quality care and are not shortchanged as they live with their disabilities?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, we're very committed to continuing good care for each of these veterans. I'd like to refer this question over to Dr. Skolton, our expert in traumatic brain injury.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, thank you. And again, let me thank the first panel for their testimony today. And we do take their experiences and their back to VA central office as well as to the medical centers where we practiced in order to improve our practices. In regards to the budget for traumatic brain injury care in VA, we have seen, fortunately, a decrease in the number of severely injured service members requiring inpatient rehabilitation from combat-related injuries. That does significantly affect the overall cost or the overall expenditure of TBI care. In fiscal year 13, we were down to 54 foreign theater injured combat wounded that were treated in our polytrauma rehab centers. That was down from 132 in fiscal year 12. When we look at all of the cases, all individuals with a TBI diagnosis in the system, there's been a significant downward trend in those individuals where the cumulative cost, the annual cumulative costs, are greater than $50,000 per fiscal year. And so in the OEF, OIF, OND population, that's gone down from 4.9% in fiscal year 10 down to 3.6% in fiscal year 13, which results in a significant decrease in total expenditure. Similarly, the percentage of non-OEF, OIF TBI cases with care costs greater than $5,000 per year have also decreased down from 12.2% in fiscal year 10 down to 10.5% in fiscal year 13. We feel that some of these, in relation to the care that's being provided, we do know that DOD has stepped up their efforts to identify individuals with traumatic brain injury. We know from the Congressional Budget Office that costs for TBI care decrease over time. So the first year is the most expensive. And so we feel that that's contributing to the overall decrease in the total cost for TBI care, despite the fact that we are seeing more individuals with TBI.
Dr. Kearney, can you explain how a veteran receiving 70% disability at the time of his military discharge due to mild TBI can be reduced to only 10% by the VA, how can this in any way be considered a seamless transition?
Thank you for the question, sir. I cannot comment specifically about this particular case. I will tell you that each of our examiners are trained in a particular way using the training that they've put before them in order to reevaluate, but I can't speak to this particular case. I don't know the details of the case to be able to respond to that question.
Are those examiners required to be licensed in their respective states?
We have a requirement for our CMP examiners to be licensed. There is, in the VA, for psychologists in particular, they have, you can be hired as a provisional psychologist in which they are reviewed for 2 years, and they have supervision during that time, and they must obtain licensure during that time before they can stay with the VA if they do not obtain licensure in that time, but they are under clinical supervision, much like our trainees.
I think testimony today says, I think clearly states that there's a problem and it needs to be resolved. Could you talk about how VA coordinates with Indian Health Services to make sure that Native American veterans receive adequate reimbursement as well as quality medical care?
I don't have any particular comment on Indian Health Services today, but I do want to ask Mr. Gardner if he could speak particularly to that in the Tucson area.
Coordination, sure.
From a coordination standpoint, again, we deal with the Tohono Nation, which is just south of us here, and we do have a coordinator that goes out on a regular basis, interacts with the staff at the cell unit, as well as looking for veterans, in fact, that are in need. We have several outreach efforts where, in fact, we look for veterans that are interested in, again, becoming a patient of ours, and we go ahead and get them enrolled. But we want to make sure, and we attempt to make sure with our Native American veterans that, in fact, we are culturally also sensitive from that aspect. We have a program in place here at Tucson where we've trained over 400 of our staff. We try to put them through a process where they learn a little bit about the Native American way, and it's taught by Native American healers, and it's important to us that happen. We also work closely with IHS, Mr. George Bearpaw, who is the regional director, and coordinate with them to make sure that services that eligible veterans can be connected with, we connect with them to make sure that transfer is made.
Ranking Member Kirkpatrick.
Dr. Schulten, nice to see you again. And you know, when I visited your polytrauma unit and you gave me a tour, we talked about how we could prevent losing some of these veterans in the transition process. And I bet it would be really good if the Department of Defense would notify you before the member becomes a veteran. Are you seeing an improvement in that notification? Do you get medical records before the military member transfers out of the service?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'd like to answer that question in 2 parts, both from my position in VA central office as well as a treating clinician at the Washington, D.C. VA. And I think most importantly, from a treating clinician standpoint, I do get medical records as patients transition from DOD to VA. Some of those records are available through our VISTA web system or within the medical record system. And I've been pleasantly surprised to be able to see more records from even from care delivered in theater for veterans that are have entered the system and maybe have gotten treatment a year or so before. When it comes to the most seriously injured, those individuals that are typically treated inpatient at a military treatment facility and then transition to one of our polytrauma rehab centers, that process is very seamless. We work very hard to introduce both the injured service member and their family to the receiving treatment team by use of a video teleconference. That allows the teams and the caregivers and the injured service member to talk about needs, to talk about transition issues and logistics of the transfer, as well as get to know what's going to happen when they arrive at the VA. In addition to that, the VA liaison that's embedded at the military treatment facility helps to make sure that all the records are available. They do a nurse-to-nurse handoff as well. And then some veterans some records are available in the computerized record system, but as a safeguard, veterans carry hand deliver a CD copy of all of their records from the military treatment facility as a safeguard. For those individuals that are being treated at a military treatment facility and living in a warrior transition unit or residing in a WTU, the VA military treatment liaison that's embedded there will contact the OEF, OIF, OND VA program manager at the receiving VA and ensure that information is transferred and that a case manager is assigned. The goal is for the case manager to contact that individual before the transfer actually happens, as well as begin to set up appointments and coordinate care once they arrive at the receiving VA.
And what about the drug formulary? Do you find that it's compatible, that you can continue the same course of treatment that they were receiving in the military when they get into the VA system?
That varies by patient or by individual veteran. There are some medications that are on the DoD formulary and not on, for instance, at the Washington, D.C. VA formulary. However, I think it's very important to note that the ordering of medications is done by the practitioner or the physician that's working with the patient, and there's a discussion about what's worked in the past, what the current medications are, and if a medication is not on a formulary but it's determined to be the correct medication, there's a non-formulary process that will help, that you can go through and get that medication. So it does work.
Dr. Kearney, I know there's been a big increase in telemedicine, and a lot of the veterans I talked to like that, but we heard in the first panel a veteran who doesn't feel comfortable with that. And so what accommodations can you make for folks who really aren't comfortable with talking with their doctor over the computer system?
Yeah, I think that's a really important concern. We want to make sure that each of our treatment plans that we work collaboratively with our veteran is something that they're comfortable with. So that is part when we are having those initial discussions about plan of care. Are they comfortable with telemental health services? Would they prefer group or individual treatment? Asking for these different things. Another option that we're also utilizing more is some of the different smartphone apps that are available now for those PTSD coach, for example. There's also a concussion app. There's cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, for example. And some of these things can walk them through treatment at home if they don't want to come in as frequently. We're also looking at our staffing levels at all of our CBOCs as well as the medical centers and trying to work with each facility who's maybe having difficulty recruiting and maintaining staffing there by having individual discussions with our visit mental health leads and with our staff at central office to see are there other things that we can be doing to recruit providers to those hard to recruit locations.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Congresswoman Sinema, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Redlin, prior to my time serving in public office, I was a licensed clinical social worker. And during my time engaging in direct therapeutic relationships with consumers, I recognize how important it is to form that relationship with a client. And of course, equally important is the termination phase. What we heard from a number of vets and vets' family members today was the additional trauma that they experienced when finding unexpected interruption of service delivery with their trusted therapist or provider. What action does your office take, and perhaps Dr. Kearney can also answer, Mr. Gardner as well, what steps are taken to help vets prepare for interruption of services or termination from their provider and transition to a new appropriate provider?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for having me here today. At the Tucson Vet Center, what I can say as far as trying to keep that continuity of care when we have possibly a counselor retiring or taking another position is get a heads up on it and try and recruit, or especially within. Just recently, I can give you an example. We actually did a very good job with this. We're able to bring on a counselor 2 months before one we knew was leaving, and that's unfortunately not the case a lot of times, and so clients are left, feeling that they have no care or their care's been severely disrupted. But that's typically what we do at the vet center. I don't know, was there other parts of the question I missed?
No, thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that's been important that we've been rolling out across the VA is that every veteran within our mental health would be assigned a mental health treatment coordinator. And that person, whether they were giving active treatment at that time or not, would be the person to make sure that if they were transitioning, say, for example, to a substance use disorder treatment program, that they got in, they got started, things were not dropped. It also helps with that creation of that seamless plan of care with the veteran. That treatment coordinator is responsible for discussing those plans. So when a provider would announce they're retiring or they're transitioning to another job, is to be able to have discussions with the mental health treatment coordinator on next steps, and also for the provider to be having those discussions. But another important thing that we're beginning to roll out within mental health is what we call behavioral health interdisciplinary programs, which is providing a care by a team, much like we do in our patient-centered medical home, the PACT, patient-aligned care teams, in which there's 3 to 4 people providing care to a patient. So they're all familiar with that patient, so that care is not going to be as much disrupted because that veteran may know the treatment team at hand. So we're hopeful that will help address some of these different things that we've heard about this morning. But also important is that mental health treatment coordinator to make sure that veteran gets the care he or she needs after that person leaves.
Thank you. Dr. Schulten, you talked about the ability for a physician, or perhaps I'm assuming a psychiatrist, to prescribe a non-formulary drug, particular psychotropic drug, if the situation warrants. However, it appears from the testimony we heard from vets and Lance's father, Mr. Davison, that is not perhaps a standard practice in many facilities. Can you help us understand why different facilities have different formularies when those of us in the mental health profession know that psychotropic drugs cannot be easily substituted one for another, like an allergy medicine could be? And how can the VA system more effectively help prescribing physicians and psychiatrists understand the procedures to go off of the formulary when situation warrants it, as in the case of Lance Davison and some of the other testimony we heard today?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. You are correct in the fact that there is differences in formularies. I unfortunately can't speak to the rationale or the decision-making process that's made between each medical center. That would be a question for our pharmacy benefits group. In regards to medications for mental health treatment, I'd like to ask Dr. Kearney for some help with that.
Yes, certainly. One of the things that we advertise quite a bit to our mental health psychiatrists and other prescribers is the clinical practice guidelines that are available within VA and DoD, which provide guidance on what medications would be best for what particular diagnoses. So that's one particular area that we provide guidance to our individuals on. The other thing that we're beginning to roll out is the Psychotropic Drug Safety Initiative. We have heard concerns, and we are concerned as well, and want to make sure that we are studying how these medications are prescribed, that we're helping providers get education as needed, that we're also helping to monitor improvements over time. And so we're currently rolling this out across the nation to be able to better monitor at each facility how these medications are being utilized.
Thank you.
There will be a second round if anybody has any additional questions. Dr. Kearney, please describe the credentialing and licensing requirements under VA directives for psychologists and other clinicians responsible for administering CMP examinations that involve TBI determinations.
So we do have a licensing requirement.
Can you speak more into the microphone and just bring it a little closer to you?
So there are requirements for any provider hired within the VA by discipline. So for psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, et cetera. For psychologists, that includes that they have obtained a PhD or a PsyD, a doctorate of psychology from an accredited institution, and that they have also fulfilled a formalized training program thereafter. We require that they have 2 years of experience before becoming a full licensed psychologist within the VA. We have credentialing boards that review these, along with our, this includes human resources, it would include local chiefs of psychology, reviewing that they meet each of these particular standards. If not, they're not allowed to be hired within the VA.
So what happens if they're working with the VA and they lose their license then?
They would no longer
Their
be able
state
to be
license.
employed with the VA. The requirement for working at the VA is that they maintain their licensure.
That was certainly not the case in Montana. Dr. Kearney, is the repeatable battery for the Association of Neuropsychological Status, the R-bands that was discussed earlier, that assessment tool, is that, how commonly is that used by the VA for TBI rating determinations?
And that I could not answer. I'd have to take that for the record, sir.
Okay. Are there any consequences for officials failing to properly manage and supervise CMP examinations involving TBI?
As with any concern that we have about an administrator or employee of our organization, we would be addressing that through our system of peer reviews, through reviews by our human resources department, et cetera. I can't speak specifically to CMP.
Is VA's, quote, the MIND study considered trustworthy given the very small percentage of eligible veterans who participated?
I'll have to defer to Dr. Skolton on that.
We can take that question for the record. I am familiar with the study. One of the study sites was actually at the Washington, D.C. VA, but I would defer to our research colleagues to provide an analysis of the number of subjects and if that reached a statistical power to make those results generalizable.
Ranking Member Kirkpatrick, any follow-up questions?
Just one quick question. Dr. Kearney, we heard from our first panel that outsourcing to the local communities would improve care. So my question is 2 parts. First of all, do you have the ability to outsource? And if so, how are the decisions made when and if to do that?
And yes, we certainly can outsource. We have fee basis that we can do. We certainly do contracts with individuals and with the different organizations outside the VA. One of the examples of that is in response to the executive order. We had 24 community pilots with Health and Human Services in order to expand our services. So we are using that as models to expand to other areas as well in our rural communities. But certainly at each facility, an individual administrator can look into fee basis. It's not based on a geographical limitation. It's based on a number of different things, including, is the service even available at the VA? Is there wait time for that service? Do we need to go ahead and refer that out to the community? So yes, we are able to do those.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Congresswoman Sinema.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In his testimony in the first panel, Mr. Bowles described receiving health care for his service-related injuries, but not receiving a benefit or designation from that service-related wound. My understanding is, based on conversations with other veterans, that this is not an isolated incident. In the cases in particular of military sexual trauma or military sexual assault, in which the survivor often chooses not to report the incident at the time it occurs for reasons, as we heard today from Mr. Bowles, but a variety of other reasons, what does the VA do, or what can the VA do, to ensure that the survivor does receive benefits at the time that he or she is able to report about that service-connected injury?
And we are very concerned about our veterans who have experienced military sexual trauma and want to ensure that they get timely treatment to care. I can't comment about VBA's decisions to give disability for any particular person overall, so I'm sorry, I'll have to take that for the record.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Sinema. Our thanks to the panel. You are now excused. Today, we have had the opportunity to hear from veterans and their families about the serious long-term consequences of traumatic brain injury. We heard about the continuing challenges veterans have in getting access to necessary services for TBI. We also heard from the VHA regarding the health care available to veterans with TBI. I expect the VA to use the discussions and issues heard today to improve upon services provided to our veterans. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials. Without objection so ordered, I would like to once again thank all of our witnesses and audience members for joining us in today's conversation. With that,
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I ask
Oh.
that the statement of Mr. Barber and Ms. Sinema's full statement be submitted to the record.
so ordered. I'd like to again thank all the witnesses and audience members for joining us today. With that, this hearing is adjourned.